We are at a point now where it is do or die. The decision to not get involved is a decision to let public interest journalism die in this country, and that can't possibly be in the public good.
Hello, I'm Paul Barry. Welcome to Media Watch. And that was Sam Dastyari, who's running a Senate inquiry into the future of public interest journalism. And tonight, in a special edition of Media Watch, we ask what can be done to save it. It's just over a year since we looked at the perfect storm facing the media. In the US, BuzzFeed had just halved its 2016 revenue forecasts. Vice, Salon, Mashable and Gawker were all laying off staff. And here in Australia, former News Corp and Fairfax editor Eric Beecher was warning that mainstream media groups, and especially newspapers, were nearing the brink because of the relentless fall in ad revenue.
They are heading towards the cliff, and it's not their fault, but they are heading towards the cliff really fast. I think that cliff is, for everybody, is within a year or two or less.
So, 1 year on, has that cliff got closer? Well, yes. Another 125 jobs have gone at the Sydney Morning Herald, Age, Fin Review and Fairfax newsrooms in Brisbane and Perth, following savage cuts in its regional papers in 2015. Up to 100 jobs have also gone at News Corp, with fears of 300 more on the way. While Seven West Media has shed around 60 journalists in its West Australian newspapers, and more in its TV business. And the struggling 10 network has gone belly up. It's no wonder Sam Dastyari is sounding the alarm.
This is a serious problem. We have gotten to the point of no return. If we want to have a proper journalistic industry here in Australia, then we have to actually start taking steps to protect it.
So, what is the damage so far? Well, as the Senate inquiry has been told by one Australian publisher,
approximately 2,500 journalism jobs have disappeared in Australia since 2011. Newspaper advertising revenue has dropped 40% in just 5 years to $2.4 billion. The economic model that has supported quality journalism is mid-collapse.
And why has that happened? Well, as Schwartz Media, publisher of The Monthly and The Saturday Paper, told the Senate,
it's not that readers are deserting the mastheads. The number of people who read them, either in print or online, has never been higher.
The problem is vanishing revenue. Newspaper sales have plummeted, and dollars from print advertising have turned into cents from digital ads. And it's a similar story around the world, as the 2017 Reuters Institute Digital News Report by Nick Newman makes clear.
Print ad revenue has continued to fall in many countries, double-digit falls in print revenue, and that is what has sustained a lot of print newspapers. Still, a lot of them are getting most of their revenue from print, so this is a really serious problem still. And digital advertising revenue, most of the growth, most of the new money that is coming into online is going to Google and Facebook, to those two companies in most countries.
Here in Australia, print advertising revenue is still falling at around 10% a year, and digital advertising is not replacing it. Mainly because, as Newman says, and as Fairfax chief Greg Hywood told the Senate, Google and Facebook are gobbling it up.
In the US, they're taking 85% of the growth in the display market, and there's similar trends in Australia. So clearly, for organisations that provide no content or deliver no original content, they are hoovering up a lot of the dollars in the market.
Almost two-thirds of online advertising in the US goes to the two digital giants, and their share is growing worldwide. With almost 2 billion monthly users, Facebook's revenue is rising at a phenomenal 50% a year, while Google's is growing at 20%, but from a far bigger base. And in Australia, they are almost as dominant. Here, Facebook has 15 million users, of which 14 million are on mobile devices. And this has brought a huge change in the way young Australians in particular get their news.
Pretty much Facebook, mostly. Sometimes Twitter, but yeah, that's about it.
The news, basically in my house, we get it from the TV mainly, but I do use Facebook a lot for my news.
The internet, that's all I get my news from. I don't watch news on TV at all. So word of mouth and social media, really.
And the fact that news is so freely available means the majority of consumers are not prepared to pay for it.
It's super cheap to pay for news, but I don't really see why you need to when it's all available online.
I feel like the news should just be free to anyone, so I don't see why I'd have to pay for it.
It's kind of at the touch of your fingertips on Facebook, so why pay for it?
7 out of 10 Australians say they would never pay for online news. And that's why Facebook and Google, who distribute it for free, are now accused of killing the industry they rely on. News Corp Australia boss Michael Miller wrote recently,
Google has done more than anything to destroy the journalism model, and the biggest losers are the Australian public.
And the same charge has been levelled both in the UK and in the US.
It's not that Mark Zuckerberg set out to dismantle the news business when he founded Facebook 13 years ago, yet news organisations are perhaps the biggest casualty of the world Zuckerberg built. There's reason to believe things are going to get worse.
And the situation is now so bad that some are proposing radical solutions. Writing in the New York Times under the headline, What Facebook Owes to Journalism, the author of an American study suggested that Google and Facebook should fork out billions of dollars to repair the damage they are causing.
We think of this as kind of a massive, unsolvable problem, the collapse of local journalism, something that's just so big that it can't possibly be fixed. In fact, Google and Facebook could fix it by writing one check each.
It is a big idea, a $4 billion fund to keep quality journalism alive, especially at the local level. But Stephen Waldman is adamant they can afford it.
As a point of reference, in 2016, the four tech giants, meaning Google, Facebook, Verizon, and Apple, posted an $88 billion profit. By comparison, the combined profit for the New York Times, Gannett, and McClatchy, the newspapers, was $41 million with an M.
Waldman is hoping he and his fellow Americans can shame Google and Facebook into doing the right thing without government intervention. But in Canada, the debate has gone further, with ex-Globe and Mail editor Ed Greenspon warning the tech giants must be made to pay up or local journalism is doomed.
Well, it's pretty bleak, I think. The largest newspaper chain in Canada is probably heading back toward bankruptcy. It came out of bankruptcy in 2010. Other news organizations are also not doing well. But by and large, we're just going to see more layoffs, fewer reporters, less coverage of the institutions of democracy and democratic discourse.
Greenspon's proposal in a report for the Public Policy Forum is to impose a levy on digital advertising sales, paid mainly by Facebook and Google. And the $300 to $400 million raised would then be ploughed back into original Canadian journalism in the form of tax breaks.
So the basis of the criteria is how much are you spending on reporting and editing? How much are you spending on the cost of journalism? And then you get a 35% rebate on what you spend on the cost of journalism at the end of the year, and therefore creating an incentive not to cut, but hopefully to reinvest.
The money would not be allowed to subsidise branded content or repackaging stories. And it would only go to publications that engage in what he calls civic function journalism. So, what are the chances of it happening?
There's a broad consensus of support for a fund, and a fund that would help support editorial hiring and the maintenance of editorial jobs and innovation. But there's not probably a great chance that the government is going to go after a proposal that puts them at odds with large multinational companies like Facebook and Google.
Back in Australia, similar ideas are now being raised, with Senator Nick Xenophon calling for a Google and Facebook tax to save Australian media companies. And Sam Dastyari and his Senate committee are pondering a similar solution.
I think the big question we have to ask is, should we be taxing the likes of Google and redirecting that money to support journalism? There is a natural sense amongst a lot of journalists that say, we don't want to have government intervention, we don't want the government playing a role, but at the same time we want journalism protected. The question is that a balance that we can get? And I personally believe the best way of getting that balance is about having some kind of a tax incentive structure scheme that is available to media companies that is paid for by the big aggregators like Google.
Dastyari believes that taxing Google and Facebook is easily done if the will is there. But how on earth do you define quality journalism and decide who then gets the money?
That is the big question, and that is the really difficult question. When we're talking about public interest journalism, the real question is, the challenge is, how do you define that? When does something start being a piece of journalism in the public good, and when is it just someone blogging about their dog on Facebook?
Agreeing on the answer to questions like that could well take years. And given that Google and Facebook are likely to fight any tax or levy, is there really any chance of an Australian government making it happen?
Well, we live in hope. We live in hope. These things happen when people want them to happen. What we have to do is raise awareness out there in the community about how serious a problem this is.
So, is there really no alternative? Well, despite all the gloom, the media is not dead yet. Ex-editor-in-chief of The Australian, Chris Mitchell, told MediaWatch his paper is now earning $25 million a year in digital subscriptions and is back in profit by virtue of not giving its content to Facebook or Google. In the UK, The Economist magazine is doing better than ever. And subscriptions for some of the big American mastheads have risen dramatically of late thanks to fake news and Donald Trump.
When you talk to publishers, they've added, 500,000 for the New York Times, for example, 200,000, 250,000 for the Wall Street Journal. And the reason for that is it's many people on the left who feel that they need to support journalism to help journalism. So almost a third of the people who are paying say they're doing so to help journalism. The big question is, can that last?
And even with this so-called Trump bump, the New York Times is still struggling because print advertising revenue has fallen yet again. And most of the smaller, local media groups in the States have seen no benefit at all.
Outside of the Capitol and the New York Times, journalism is struggling and in as much of a crisis as ever. And in fact, are still laying off people, still cutting their newsrooms in half, still taking away reporters from City Hall. And that's a real crisis for democracy. If you don't have good local reporting, you are not going to have an informed citizenry.
As one study in Seattle and Denver discovered in 2014, dead newspapers reduce civil engagement. That is, fewer people contact local politicians, take protest action, or join school or community groups once their papers close. In Britain, local news has also been dying back for years, but in a radical new initiative, the BBC is doing its bit to help.
You have the BBC now putting 150 reporters into commercial news organisations, and the journalism they do is going to be shared between those newspapers and the BBC locally. It'll be interesting to see how it works and whether it is possible for the commercial and public service models to work together.
That's a model Australia could perhaps copy, but the ABC tells us it has no plans to do so. However, even Facebook agrees that local news needs protecting, with Mark Zuckerberg's manifesto published in February accepting that Facebook has a duty to keep the community intact. And in its submission to the Senate inquiry, Facebook says it wants to, quote,
find ways for journalism and news to flourish on our platform.
Google has also launched several initiatives, including Google News Lab, to support public interest journalism.
At the News Lab, we strongly believe in the importance of quality journalism and the journalists who produce it.
But while these may be positive steps, or perhaps just PR, they don't solve the fundamental problem for the media industry, which is lack of money, and the fact that Google and Facebook are taking it away. As Nick Newman sums it up,
somebody needs to pay for journalism. I mean, there's a realisation that advertising isn't going to do it on its own, and there's a realisation that there is an imbalance between the money that the platforms are making and those who are creating content, i.e. the publishers. Now, some people are suggesting regulation, some people are suggesting a tax, and other people feel that the most important thing is that publishers stand on their own 2 feet, and there is just a better terms of trade. So however it's done, I think we will see some shifts in the next year or so. I think the platforms are going to have to pay more, directly or indirectly.
And that is something that was not even on the agenda 1 year ago. We'll see if it leads to anything other than talk. Senator Dastyari's committee resumes hearings in Sydney tomorrow. It's expected to report before the end of the year. And you can read more about tonight's programme on our Facebook page or our website, where you can read Google's and Facebook's submissions to the Senate inquiry and a response from News Corp. You can also catch up with us on iView and contact me or MediaWatch on Twitter. And don't miss Media Bites every Thursday. But for now, until next week, that's all from us. Goodbye.